It's just like a generation is gone, and it's just amazing to think if those people are still alive, what the art world, the theater world would be like. It would be very different.
Where AIDS came from, God only knows.
I think that I've been terrorized as a gay man into believing things about HIV and AIDS that are not provable.
It was just a crazy construct in the beginning. The original definition of AIDS doesn't have any resemblance to the current definition of AIDS.
That's not an epidemic. The number of cases reported went up epidemically, exponentially, because the number of tests that was done went up exponentially.
It follows a long-standing tradition of basically dumping our abandoned drugs onto the third world.
It's really society that's killing these people in general, and modern medicine that's killing them in particular.
I believe I'm alive after 20 years of being HIV positive because I didn't take AZT or any anti-AIDS drug.
As long as AZT remains on the market, we continue to be betrayed.
I think there is a severe crisis in science as a whole, and in medical sciences in particular. They don't question anything.
The entire AIDS establishment is absolutely guilty of some hideous sins, and everybody's been fooled. That's hard to believe. See, I was like, no, it can't be.
I would say we have acquired information deficiency syndrome or a scandal.
We maintain that HIV is a big mistake, possibly one of the biggest mistakes of the 20th century.
How is this virus causing AIDS? How is it causing the depletion of immune cells when you can't even find it?
Nobody has ever seen HIV. We have seen diagrams of HIV, we've seen posters, all of those with drawings of HIV, but this is only theoretical, the way that it ought to be.
When two different parties look at the same data and come to different conclusions, it's no longer scientific.
Actually, AIDS is a religion of these people. They believe in this virus.
There is so much money being pumped into AIDS that people have no incentive whatsoever to see the truth.
Maintaining this industry, maintaining this whole idea that there's this epidemic pending and that HIV causes AIDS is a major public relations process in the United States.
If a hypothesis fails to produce results, that we have to reconsider that hypothesis.
I'm in the Museum of the City of New York. There is a 20-year retrospective on AIDS. In this retrospective, if you look around, there's beautiful posters and very poignant and touching photographs and stories of people who have been afflicted with AIDS. Also, all along the walls are little charts, chronologies of events, like when AIDS was discovered, and then the test, the antibody test, that people should be tested to determine, do they have this deadly disease? That there is hope, not for a cure, but instead put time on your side. Take AZT or other antiretroviral cocktails. That's the messages. I'm Gary Null, and I'd like to open up a dialogue that allows those who've been excluded from the communication in the war on AIDS to have a forum. These individuals are sincere, they are credentialed, and they have a lot of good questions and challenging statements for those who are absolutely convinced that everything we've been taught about AIDS is right. It is the intent of this program to have a forum for the dissidents. The most responsible and reasoned of those individuals, you're now going to have an opportunity to see what their argument is as they try to deconstruct what they consider the myth of AIDS.
Professor David Rasnick, one of the developers of the protease inhibitors commonly used for persons with AIDS, came from a scientific established background. He has done extensive research on the subject of AIDS and is now one of the most outspoken AIDS dissidents.
The best evidence against the HIV hypothesis is that there is no evidence for it. In the vast scientific medical literature, over 100,000 journals published so far on HIV/AIDS, we cannot find anywhere in this vast literature the evidence that HIV causes AIDS, that AIDS is a contagious disease or that it's even sexually transmitted. If this had been shown, that AIDS is caused by HIV, we should know who these benefactors of humanity are by name. These would be candidates for the Nobel Prize. But I challenge you, any American, journalist, scientist, to come up with the names of these individuals who we should revere and should honor with awards and things. And I think you will find that you won't be able to come up with it.
In 1984, Luc Montagnier wrote in Nature, quote, "All available data are consistent with the virus being the causative agent of AIDS," end of quote. But in 1985, he expressed an opinion which is impossible to reconcile with the HIV theory. I quote, "This syndrome occurs in a minority of infected persons who generally have in common a past history of antigenic stimulation," that means immune stimulation, "and of immune depression before HIV infection." In other words, Montagnier was claiming that the cause of the immune depression was coming after the effect, which is contradictory. Perhaps Montagnier was hedging his bets even at that early stage.
14 years ago, Dr. Peter Duesberg was the lone voice in the world of AIDS dissonance. At that time, the molecular biologist, world-renowned virologist, and UCLA professor began asking a question that seemed like heresy in his day. Was it possible that we were wrong when we equated HIV with AIDS?
Gallo tried in hundreds of patients to find that virus and came up with a sample that he borrowed from a French colleague. I know Gallo, and Gallo is not a bad virologist. He would have found a virus that is there at concentrations where it could cause a disease. But Gallo proved to the scientific world with this, what proved to be nearly a scandal in the scientific history. He claimed the virus from a colleague as his own. He proved that it was very, very difficult, even for an excellent laboratory as Gallo was operating it at the NIH, to isolate a virus from an AIDS patient.
There has never been viremia, which means the blood flooded with whole cell-free infectious viruses. If HIV were actually doing anything, making people sick, there would indeed be viremia, meaning millions of whole viruses per milliliter of plasma. In fact, nobody has ever observed even one of them.
HIV is so clever that it knows to cause Kaposi sarcoma in gay men. 98% of all Kaposi sarcoma is in gay men. HIV knows to cause tuberculosis and wasting in IV drug users, and it knows to cause diarrhea and candidiasis or thrush in hemophiliacs.
It's not just Peter Duesberg or some heretics or some outsiders who criticize the failure of our war against AIDS. It's the orthodoxy itself. They advertise they have not saved one single life with $60 to $80 billion. That means in conventional scientific logic, there could very well be something profoundly wrong with the basic hypothesis, with the basic approach that we use against AIDS.
Some of the most vocal critics of the HIV equals AIDS hypothesis are a group of Australian researchers led by Dr. Eleni Papadopoulos-Eliopoulos. In their breakthrough report, the scientists raised serious questions about the accuracy of HIV antibody tests, and more importantly, the very relationship of HIV to AIDS. In fact, in their newest work, they are questioning, has HIV even been isolated?
As far as we're concerned, if one goes through all the HIV literature which exists to date, I think one will find it bold and incredible to still believe that there is proof for the existence of HIV. When a particle looks like a retrovirus, you have to isolate it, then put it in another culture, show that the cells in the secondary culture produce particle exactly like the particles from which they originated. The two particles from the two cultures are exactly the same, can be shown only by determining their constituent proteins in RNA. So isolation is extremely important to prove that a particle is a retrovirus.
From the mid-70s until 1984, when the